Welcome to Making Peace Visible. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. Researchers have long observed the effect of traumatic experiences on veterans and victims of war. The term post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, came into usage during the Vietnam War. It describes symptoms like intrusive memories, nightmares, hyperarousal, avoidance, and emotional numbness. The concept of intergenerational trauma, also called historical trauma, was popularized by Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, a clinical social worker and researcher working with Native Americans. She defined it as a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma experiences. I think intergenerational trauma is a very helpful lens for understanding the Israel Palestine conflict. Most reporting you'll see in the news focuses on the horrific violence and suffering of the last 6 months, which is critically important. But it's also crucial to understand the psychological state that has developed over generations on both sides, which enables people to commit such violent acts. Today, we're privileged to talk to Lydia Wilson, a brilliant writer and researcher, now the culture editor at New Lines magazine. She's also a research fellow at Oxford Center for the Resolution of Intractable Conflict. Lydia has spent a good part of her career studying conflict, the perpetrators and the victims, and the impact of long-term violence on humans. Lydia, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
You know, one thing you've looked at, which I think is extremely valuable and very relevant to what's going on right now, is the concept of inherited or intergenerational trauma. In what ways are the impacts of trauma passed from people who experience the traumatic event onto their children or grandchildren?
Yeah, this is absolutely huge. We see it in many civil conflicts from Lebanon to Northern Ireland to Cyprus, that there has been a traumatic event, say the Armenian genocide or the Holocaust or Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland, where it hasn't been resolved. So there hasn't been a process of reconciliation or any form of justice. Justice is very important for coming beyond that level of trauma. Perceived justice, obviously you can have legal cases that satisfy nobody. You know, obviously it has to be agreed on by the whole community. And so when these traumas are not addressed in any way, they are passed on to the children. Now, sometimes this is sanctioned by the entire group. Sometimes it's just family, parents to children. But sometimes these become almost mythologized. Varmit Volkan, the large group psychologist, he calls this a group's chosen trauma, where the whole group recognizes that this was a landmark in their group's history, and they memorialize, they re-traumatize with rituals, with books, with retellings as a community. And then to some extent, their identity becomes locked around this chosen trauma. So not only is it held in the memory of the group, it actually becomes part of the identity of the group. And then the search for justice, the search for putting it right, becomes part of the next generation and the next generation and the next generation's responsibility.
How is the impact of intergenerational trauma different from other forms of trauma?
I suppose the major difference is it wasn't experienced directly. And so in some case, it's been formalized. You know, it's become put into a form where it can be retold and repeated because the experience doesn't belong to the individuals anymore. Maybe they've passed away or, you know, the next generation hasn't experienced it directly. Not always, because there are cases where these traumas are ongoing, and we're looking at that in Palestine right now.
So given the fact that it's being passed on like that, it makes it very difficult for people to have a sense of resolution around it.
There are many psychologists and psychiatrists and group psychotherapists working on that exact issue of healing past wounds for the whole community. And we saw that happen in the Colombian peace process, and we've seen attempts in Cyprus and Israel Palestine, and we've seen very successful interventions in Northern Ireland. And so there's a variety of ways that things can be addressed. It's just that they all of them rely on political will. It's not whether we know how to do this or not, it's whether it's possible politically. And there are so many governments around the world where peace isn't really the point. They see the whole situation as a zero-sum game. And so giving any ground is seen as defeat. When you're locked into one of these psychological states of existential threat, giving anything at all to the group that you perceive as threatening your very existence is seen as weak to your followers. It's something to be scared of to reach a hand out. So it's not that we can't address these things. It's what's needed, what the kind of situation that's needed to get people into the space where they can.
You know, taking it a little further, you were part of a team that interviewed fighters and their family and friends in areas that have experienced violent conflict, including Iraq and Lebanon and Kosovo and Northern Ireland. And in each of these countries, you asked individuals about their identities. You used a set of cards with overlapping circles. Can you describe the exercise and why your team felt it was important?
So these cards are so useful, partly because they're very intuitive. So let's see if I can describe them. It's a series of overlapping circles, as you said. Each set of overlapping circles, there's one big one and one little one. So the big one represents a group, the little one represents you, the individual. Now, on the far left, the two circles are apart. Then the next one, they just touch. The next one, they overlap a little bit. The next one, they overlap half and half. Then they overlap a lot. And finally, on the far right, the little circle is nested right inside the big circle. And so I start usually by saying, okay, the big circle is your family. Now, normally that's quite an easy one for anybody to answer. And then I'll go on to friends. And then it depends on the situation, but it will be their faction, whether that's Protestant or Catholic in Ireland, or Christian Sunni Shia in Lebanon, or, Kurd Arab maybe. I will start to probe different parts of that individual social grouping. And we'll get on to religion, and religion will be both the actual religion, say Islam, and then it'll be Muslims worldwide, because that's perceived very differently. And what we're looking for is how fused somebody is to different groups. Now, most of us have a full range of fusions. We're a little bit fused to all sorts of groups, our fellow co-workers, our local activity interest group, our hobbies, whatever. We belong a little bit, but it's not an essential part of our identity. And then there are our close friends. Normally, these are so important to us that we're very fused to that. And our families, of course, and all the rest of it. But there's a range. In a healthy individual, there's a whole range of groups that we feel a whole range of emotions towards. Now, the fully fused individual has one identity that they're fully fused to, and family doesn't even touch it. Unless, of course, the family is involved in the same fight. And then they say it makes no difference. They're Kurds as well, or they're Catholics as well, or whatever it might be. So that's what we're looking for with that particular probe, how many groups they belong to and to what extent.
So that's interesting. And now, what did you learn about the connection between identity and violent conflict from those experiments?
It's when one part of the identity is fused and nothing else is, then they express a willingness to make more extreme sacrifices than if that was not the case. Now, we went on to probe the connection between this so-called fusion theory and sacred values theory, and to see how that interacted. And my colleague Scott Atran, he developed a model called the devoted actor model. And a devoted actor was both fully fused and shared and had sacralized, as we say, the values of the group, so that they couldn't negotiate over them, but also anyone who didn't hold them were in the wrong. And that's what makes violence possible. When you've been told that your group has the moral superiority over an outgroup, it becomes easier and easier to commit violence against the outgroup.
If being traumatized is a psychological state that we call PTSD that perpetuates violent extremism, can mental health counseling be used as a tool to de-radicalize fighters? Have you seen any success in this realm?
Now, I think we have to be careful about the categories we're using, because the theories I've been talking about are psychological states, the fusion, the values, and all the rest of it. When we look at people who perform extreme self-sacrifice for the sake of a wider cause or a wider group, there is actually no correlation with mental health at all. There are no markers through any sort of disorders that differentiate them from the rest of the population. You know, it's the same as the background rate of the population they're from. In terms of trauma, this isn't really a case, as far as I understand it, and I'm not the expert, of PTSD. This inherited trauma operates in a very different way, as far as I understand. And yes, there are interventions that we can do, but they have to occur on the group level. This is a group level pathology in the way that you mentioned in terms of the inherited trauma. That's a group level pathology that has to be treated on the group level. PTSD, yes, there are cases of PTSD, but it's not going to address the majority of these fighters we're talking about.
One aspect of the October 7th attacks and the current war that's hard to understand is that Hamas was well aware that the consequences for Gaza would be devastating. And some have argued that the point of the attacks was to provoke an outsized response from Israel. Do you think this kind of suicidal thinking can be explained through an understanding of trauma?
Yes, I do. That is one of the features, I think, of this conflict, is this, what the psychoanalyst Charles Strozier calls an apocalyptic mindset. They really are going all out to trigger apocalyptic level violence to basically force the issue. They've been living under occupation for so long and been limited in their freedoms for so long that nobody really sees a future. And that's one of the major drivers I've seen throughout all my research, is when you see no future, you've got nothing to lose. And it's been a tactic of many terror groups to invite an outsized response, partly to kind of waste resources. And what they were hoping in this case was that Israel would also squander global reputation. And I think in that case, there's evidence that they have. I mean, I don't know exactly what Hamas were really aiming for. There are so many theories around, and we haven't really gained a very clear sense of that. Many people said they didn't hope to achieve what they achieved on October the 7th. They had no idea they would get so far. They thought they'd be stopped much earlier. So I'm not sure to what extent they thought the reaction would take, if you see what I mean.
I really like the quote that you took from Gerald Fromm. The Holocaust for Israelis and the Nakba for Palestinians condense into two words a multitude of horrific experiences suffered by millions of people. When members of the victimized group are unable to bear the humiliation, reverse their helplessness, or mourn their losses, they pass on to their children powerful, emotionally charged images of their injured selves. I guess that's his way of describing inherited trauma.
Yeah, it is extremely powerful. And then what happens, of course, is that both of them, and these are within living memory, just both of them.
Right.
We have people who alive who lived through both those events. What happens is that the entire population then feels under existential threat. And in this situation, they're living alongside each other, and they both feel utterly threatened by the other. And that is a situation where the trauma is going to increasingly lock each other away.
I mean, I can say from my own family's perspective that it's not just the Holocaust that's given Jews this inherited sense of victimhood. I mean, my family were wealthy Jews from Baghdad, and Jews have played an important role in Baghdadian culture for 2,500 years. Nevertheless, my grandfather had to flee the country overnight in 1929 because he would have been killed the next day just for being a wealthy Jew.
We've seen the same across Europe, repeated anti-Semitic events. I'm talking to you from York in the north of England, and we had a dreadful occurrence of mass burning of the Jewish population in the 12th century. I mean, we haven't had a Jewish population since well, bits and pieces, but until this, we haven't had a rabbi until this year, 800 years later. These things are in memory. You know, these things have a massive effect and they're repeated in Europe. You're right. It's not just the Holocaust. The Holocaust has come to stand in for all of the anti-Semitism in Europe because of the extent and scale of it, but it was by no means the first.
And given what's going on, it may not be the last either.
I am terrified to agree with you, but yes, the anti-Semitism is rising across the world, partly as a result of this conflict, partly because of other trends in conspiracy theories online. I've noticed rising anti-Semitism in my own work in online far-right spaces. I've noticed the rise of anti-Semitic conspiracies that are ancient tropes about, you know, bankers and money and behind the scenes and pulling the strings. All of those things I've seen rise in the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, basically this kind of precariousness can provoke in Jewish people a kind of hypervigilance from centuries of persecution. Israel is supposed to be a safe haven from that, but in a way, it makes sense from an Israeli perspective to defend it by all means necessary.
That is the very definition of the inherited trauma, isn't it? That waking up of the memories of centuries. And then it puts you said it, hypervigilant, hyper alert. And then, yeah, you're much less likely to have the space, the generosity of mind to see the other person's side because you're living in fear.
Yeah, and you know, everything's become so polarized that even being willing to see the other person's side, you become accused of being in favor of the other person's side. And that's not necessarily the case.
And again, groups can act quite negatively there by policing their members and calling them some version of traitor for listening to the other side.
Yeah.
And then again, it becomes socially unacceptable to say these things, and it can get to the level of ostracization. And so, yeah, you've got a group identity there who is sharing this trauma, is actually policing each other to retreat further into those psychological boundaries.
Well, that being said, during Israel's war of independence and the war in Gaza now, as well as most of the smaller conflicts in the intervening 75 years, it's Palestinians who face the greater share of death and economic damage and humiliation. What would it take for Palestinians to be able to, as Fromm says, reverse their humiliation and mourn their losses?
Well, yeah, humiliation is one of the biggest human drivers. We all fear it, and we all become very angry when we feel we have been humiliated or a loved one has been humiliated. And that can include members of a group that you haven't even met, but you're bonded to them just through membership of the group. So if you are fully fused, in the words of our psychology theory, you actually feel the insult to yourself. You feel it as a psychological wound when somebody maybe across the world has been humiliated for for the membership of the group that you share. And so Palestinians have been humiliated on a daily basis in ways that were big and small. You know, the very microaggressions on the street, or the being prevented crossing checkpoints to the point where people die at checkpoints because they need medical attention, or they're giving birth at checkpoints, or that kind of, you know, actual life or death situations. And then there's the random shootings, the random violence, the beatings,
Right.
all of these things. And imagine seeing your mother or your father, a vulnerable member of your family, being humiliated like that. And you can't do anything in case you lose your life. And you just have to witness that humiliation. It really does build up. And your question about how to reverse that humiliation it's not only salient, it's really difficult to foresee in the current political situation. To reverse the humiliation in ways that are going to be less damaging would require wholesale political change from Israel. We need people to live in peace and dignity and self-determination. And it sounds basic because we in the West take that for granted.
Yeah, I mean, you've said that there's no chance for peace. I mean, that's what you're saying now, in a sense. There's no chance for peace without ending the occupation, which sounds simple, but it's very complicated. In Jordan, you interviewed Mohammed El Arabiat, CEO and president of the Generations for Peace, which is an NGO dedicated to building peace through young people. A very relevant cause given the topic of this interview. He's going through a period of soul-searching. He's wrestling with the fact that his organization takes funding from Western donors who also support Israel. Can you tell us about Arabiat's struggle?
So Jordan's population is over half Palestinian. They've received waves of Palestinians from 48 and 67 especially, and 91 as well, when many were expelled from Kuwait. But also just the nature of the region. Before Britain and France carved up the Middle East, a lot of these tribal family ties crossed the what are now national borders. So, and Jordan and Palestine are on the different banks of the River Jordan. They're not exactly far away. And so there's a huge amount of very close connection between every single Jordanian and Palestine. Even if you're not Palestinian yourself, a worker or somebody in your family is married, or you've got friends, you've been at school with Palestinians. And so it's personal. Every death is personal. And he said his workforce is a microcosm of Jordan, so of course it's more than half Palestinian. And he had to go into work and claim that they were fighting for peace and look them in the eye when he'd been to the American embassy taking money when the Americans were telling Israel, go for it, carry on bombing Gaza. And he couldn't do it. He couldn't go back to his workforce and look them in the eye after taking money like that. And that's very difficult, because if he doesn't take international money, he can't pay them. And so you really have to soul search. What is the more important thing here? He knows they're doing important work. Generations for Peace does fantastic work across the world, bringing young people together through programs to do with sport and art and other things, other activities. And so he wants it to keep going. He doesn't want the financial security to disappear. He went to one meeting right after the conflict started, and it was a representative of a European institution. And this person said, okay, what we're worried about is anti-Semitism. And Mohammed couldn't believe really what he was hearing, because that wasn't the concern on the streets of Jordan. He was hearing grief and anger against America and Israel. He wasn't hearing things against Jews. He was hearing grief for Palestinians. And addressing anti-Semitism wasn't going to do anything to help anybody. In fact, there's early research indicators to show that the response of the world to this war has reduced anti-Semitism in the Arab world. Now, there's nothing robust that I've heard about yet, but all these images of Jews in peace marches around the world, including on the streets of Jerusalem, have done a great job in actually distinguishing Israel and Jews in many people's eyes.
No, that's a very important phenomenon. And, there are a lot of people who feel that until the government of Israel changes, there can't be real change. But that's a political issue. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about is the role of journalists. You're a journalist, and what do you think journalists can do in the way they report on these conflicts to help mitigate some of the horrific inherited trauma?
That's a really interesting question. I do wish journalists were better informed about the large group psychology, because I think once you understand how trauma works down the generations, you can be just a little bit more understanding of different sides. Now, that's not to excuse any of this extreme violence, but I think it doesn't help to permanently condemn, because all you will achieve is increased polarization, because people won't go to the other side. They won't go looking out the opinions that don't agree with them. We know people do not consume news like that. And some people might, and that's fine. And I'm happy to hear from them. But the majority of people, and this is based on research, they read what they already agree with. And so if you're just permanently condemning, judging the other side, for legitimate reasons, I understand that, you are only going to increase the sense of self-righteousness on your side, and that's not going to help long term. It's difficult, though. It's really hard because news is brief and quick response, and it's hard to get everything right. We know that there's been so much misreporting from this conflict because there's so much misinformation for a start, but also it's just so hard getting it all straight in such a complicated, long-running conflict.
No, and I think nuance is clearly not available to people right now. Everything's too quick, too summary, too brief to allow for nuance, to allow for deeper understanding of the nature of the conflicts and the nature of the players in this conflict.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons New Lines exists. We only do long form essays and we try and do deep dive original angles on everything we cover. And so we do try and capture that nuance. But I realise that's for a time-privileged sector of the population, maybe. I mean, we've proved that people want these sorts of things. You know, many people said at the beginning, oh, nobody reads long things anymore. Well, we've proved that's definitely not the case. There's a massive thirst for more fleshed out understanding. But it's not available. It's not available in a lot of outlets. And I understand that. But I do think that if journalists had some basic training in psychological understanding of large group psychology in particular, and in the role of things like humiliation and grievance, I think there might just be a slight softening of the judgmental tone of some of these articles we're seeing.
Yeah. Interviewing people about traumatic events is tricky. I mean, you don't want to re-traumatize them or trigger a flashback. What are some of the important things to keep in mind if you're speaking to journalists?
I think the overall framework of understanding inherited trauma would lead to better writing. In terms of better interviewing practice, I mean, there's all the framing that I learned from academia. So I spent a long time in academia, and our ethical process, a lot of it was to do with the initial framing of the interview, which is you don't have to answer any question you don't want to do. You can stop this at any time. You can tell me what I'm missing out. You can answer different questions. Tell me what I'm missing. You know, you can explain anything you like to me. And as long as there's that sense of agency that you're giving to people rather than, you know, doorstepping them or, you know, alarming them. Now, this is especially important in places where there's the strong culture of hospitality, where people feel they should be speaking to you. If you give them the agency very clearly to say you can stop at any time, or you can take this interview in a direction you want at any time, then actually they can end up feeling very grateful, because what a lot of people want is to express their stories. And I found that with people all over the world, including fighters who are in prison or who have been in prison. They want an opportunity to explain that they're not bad people. And there are reasons for what they did. And so actually being interviewed can be a positive experience as long as you give that agency right into their hands from the very start.
Yes, yes. Let me ask you one last question. Given your balcony view, can you imagine a peaceful end when the two parties are suffering from inherited trauma or fused identities like the way you've described them?
Sadly, I can't see that in the near future, but that doesn't mean that we can't plant the seeds that will lead to a happier, more stable region in the future. I think the damage done in this last 6 months is so deep, and there isn't the will or the space for genuine dialogue. And what are called the facts on the ground, that is all the settlements that have carved up the West Bank so that it can no longer be a political entity. That means that there's no real opportunity for state building for Palestine either. So a lot has to happen before the groundwork for peace can be laid. And some of that is psychological work, some of that is dialogue work, but a lot of it is political. And that's what I can't see happening.
Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you think is an important consideration in looking at inherited trauma and intergenerational trauma?
I mean, I suppose just because my mind's on Israel Palestine, because that's what we talked about last, I think one thing to really express is I've talked about this in a fairly symmetrical way. We've talked about the Holocaust and Nakba as traumas and all the rest of it, but it isn't symmetrical. The Palestinians feel like they are being blamed for a trauma that they didn't commit. They didn't commit the Holocaust. Now, they have committed all sorts of violence against Israel and Israelis, notably on October the 7th. Terrible violence. But they feel as if they are carrying Europe's guilt and being punished for Europe's actions. And so there really isn't, they feel that they are under occupation, and it's the occupying power who committed their trauma of the Nakba in 1948.
Right.
But they didn't give the trauma to Israel. The trauma that we've talked about has happened again and again for centuries. And so, yeah, I would say that there isn't really very much symmetry, and there's no symmetry in their strength either.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us today, because there are a lot of questions that have been provoked by this horrific war. You've helped us shed a little bit of light on some of these deep questions. So I really want to thank you for joining us today.
I'm just so sorry I wasn't able to give a little bit more hope. I do think if I can try and offer a crumb of hope, I think that what has happened is that we've seen networks of solidarity building around the world. We've seen global solidarity and new movements against war and violence as an answer to some of these problems. And I think that might have a little bit of hope for the future.
Well, as they say in the Middle East, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you.
You can find Lydia Wilson's writing at newlinesmagazine.com. You can also hear her on New Lines podcast, The Lead, spelled L-E-D-E. Follow her on X at LSM Wilson. We have links to Lydia's essay, The Psychology of the Intractable Israel Palestine Conflict, as well as her recent reporting from Jordan, in the show notes. Making Peace Visible is produced and edited by Andrew Maraskin. Additional editing and mixing by Faith McClure. I'm Jamil Simon. If you like what you heard and you think someone you know should hear it, please share this episode. An easy way to do that is to take a screenshot of your podcast player and text it to a friend. You can also send them to our website, makingpeacevisible.org. Want to tell us what you think? Leave a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, or Spotify. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.